Hi, everybody. This is Hot House. I'm your host, Patrick Howard Burnett. Our mission at Hot House is to identify solutions to our most pressing challenges. Today, I'm joined by Steve Kanter, Dean Emeritus of the Lewis and Clark School of Law. Welcome, Mr. Kanter. Thanks for
Morning,
joining.
Patrick. Good to be with you.
Same here. So you and I had the pleasure of meeting you a few weeks ago when you had testified at the City of Portland City Council. And it seems like we've had some shared experiences with the 911 system. Would you care to just briefly recount your experience and what led you to give that testimony?
Sure. I should say a little bit about the event that gave rise to it. On Saturday, July 15th, I had been driving on the east side on Belmont, taking a right on Cesar Chavez, getting ready to take a left on Hawthorne. And I saw a vehicle, it was about 6:15, 6:20 in the evening. I saw a vehicle come by me very rapidly in the right-hand curb lane. And as he pulled abreast, I could see a woman that was standing at the bus stop at the corner of Cesar Chavez, right about Taylor, I think. And unfortunately, he was out of control. The vehicle was out of control and going very, very fast, went up on the sidewalk. She was standing relatively far back from the sidewalk under the bus stop. There's not a huge amount of leeway there, but she was not right up at the curb or anything. But his vehicle went up on the curb and just drove right through her. It was horrific. And then at some point, I don't really know whether he hit something or tried to cut his wheel, but his vehicle started to roll over back into the roadway, came to a stop on his top right next to my car, which was stopped. It was only, as I say, about 6:20 in the afternoon, early evening. So there were other people around. Of course, I got out of my car. They were around. We immediately tried to figure out what to do. Two of us called 911 right away. I know that I called at 9:20. So this happened between 6:19 and 6:20. And we told everybody else not to call so that we didn't overload the system. Tried to send somebody for help and, keep the crowd kind of out of danger in the roadway and so on. We were on hold. Eventually, an individual crawled out of the upturned car, out of a broken window, I think. I had very little contact with him. I did ask him if there was anybody else in his vehicle. He said no. We had to kind of do what we could do. Unfortunately, during all this time, 911 never picked up the phone. It wasn't that somebody picked up and said, can we place you on hold, or how important is this or something? They just never picked up the phone. So both the other woman and I were on hold for quite an extended time. Eventually, an SUV that had fire department logo on it came by, but it was not in response to the 911 calls we were trying to make. There is apparently a fire station nearby, and I think it was just accidental. He was not medically trained, apparently. He quickly got back in his vehicle, and they have an internal network, and he got a fire truck to come with some EMTs. But by that point, a lot of time had gone by. She may well have been dead on impact, but certainly by the time help got to her, she was unfortunately deceased.
Yeah.
He was I found out later, she was a relatively young mother and the children's librarian at the branch library.
Yeah.
So it was just a really horrific, tragic situation. I will say the police then came, and of course, once they got there, they were quite professional and handled the situation professionally. But they had not gotten any call rapidly, nor the others. So
Yeah.
This is not the only time that 911 has not been responsive. I have heard from many people since that event of somewhat similar circumstances. And mistakes happen, of course, in any system, but this is a problem that has been ongoing in our city for a while. And it just seems to me it's unacceptable. It won't solve all other problems, but we've got to have 911 answering the phone right away and triage.
Yeah. Steve, thanks for sharing that story. It must have been horrific, a horrific experience. I happened to be driving by that intersection that day. I came sometime afterwards, and by then, the first responders had all arrived, and it's become a notorious case in the city of Portland. Just recently, they announced that they were going to do some traffic calming measures there, putting an island, a pedestrian island, in the middle of Cesar Chavez Boulevard. But all that's kind of reactive to a problem that really is ongoing. And my wife and I have had similar concerns in our neighborhood. There's been a couple of incidents that would require immediate response, and we've talked to 911 or called 911. And you're right, the response times are quite long. One person had what they're calling a mental health crisis and stabbed another individual just a couple of blocks from us. And another incident involved two young men who were in a stolen car, and they in turn were victims of a shooting. The perpetrator got away, but these sort of events, these violent crimes, really need a rapid response. And I spent 20 plus years in the emergency department, taking care of families that were whose family members were the victim of medical emergencies, traumatic injury. I just can't imagine being on the phone with 911, waiting and waiting and waiting for someone to pick up while an active crime is in progress, or you have to do CPR. It must be terribly demoralizing.
Yes. And, Patrick, you've had a lot more experience with your medical involvement, but as you say, it's not just violent crime, as important as that is, but people with medical emergencies. There are all kinds of things that come up. I'm sure we've had a great increase. We're having a lot of problems in the city. We're not going to solve them all instantly. And frankly, even if we were able to have adequate resources and fix 911, so we could at least get a rapid response, people would know they're going to get talked to right away, then you can start doing triage. Many of those calls, I'm sure, don't need an instant response of some vehicles coming out, but those that do, there's no alternative. And if we don't have the phone getting picked up, there's no chance that we can get that response to the situations that are needed. And it just seems to me that, and I know that, we have problems with ambulance services and adequacy of police resources and so on. But so maybe if every call were getting answered, we wouldn't have resources to respond to all of them, but at least then we would know. We would have accurate data about where we need to be funneling our resources, because it seems to me that if the city loses confidence in the ability of these kinds of fundamental safety precautions, we won't run the real risk of devolving as a community.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's one of many issues that Portland's facing, but I think it's one that affects everybody. The person on the street, can look at that system and say, well, if that's dysfunctional, the thing that we really, really need to be highly functioning, if that's not working, then what else is not working? I think the 311 and the non-emergency system has decompressed 911 quite a bit, but I'm certain that a percentage, and perhaps a large percentage, of people that still call 911 don't actually have a true emergency. So we talked about what the performance indicators should be. I think you mentioned it should pick up, 911 should pick up in 3 rings. I think that's a reasonable standard. I think the national standard is something like 90% of the time it should pick up in 10 seconds. And I think our system is now at about 55 seconds, which is a long time if you're in crisis. And that's down from over a minute and 10 seconds over the last couple of years, but still, 54 seconds is a long time and not acceptable.
Yeah. Well, I'm certainly not an expert on the system, but it does seem to me that the key is to have a big enough funnel so that you've got folks that can answer right away. And then they would have enough training so that they can triage those calls. The ones that are really the most critical go immediately to the most experienced, longest trained individuals who know how to handle. I mean, we could have a hostage situation or something like that. You do need some people who are really sophisticated and well trained, but you can't afford to have everybody at that level. You have to have enough people who are competent and trained, but who are capable of doing the triage and sifting the calls into. I'm sure they're trying to do that. I'm not picking on anybody. I will say, one positive after I felt I had to say something. I knew the city was aware of it, but making it graphic and getting people to talk and insist that we find an acceptable solution for this seems to me very important. After my testimony, I have been contacted by, I think, the head of the actual 911 operation. He has invited me to come down. I'll certainly do that. I don't expect to be critical of what their people are doing. The problem is we don't have apparently enough people at the first, most, in a way, superficial but most important level of getting those calls answered. I don't know if we have enough phone lines, but I'm sure we don't have enough people capable of answering right away.
Yeah. So we contacted the office of Rene Gonzalez, who's the city commissioner in charge of the 911 system. And they did have some important statistics, including the improvement, although not adequate, but improvement in the response time. But they say that some 40 plus people are going through the system of training and are coming online as soon as they finish their training. The problem that I see, and I think you agree, is that the training is 18 months long. 18 months. That is an awfully long time. That's a heck of a pipeline to have to go through. And the way I see it is that, like any first responder, there's very basic skills and then highly sophisticated skills. A paramedic can give IV drugs and intubate and defibrillate and do all kinds of very high level procedures and high level of skill. We need those people, but we also need to train people to do basic CPR, and we need people to be able to perform rescue airways, and that spectrum, I think, is a good model that can be used to train people that, in a matter of, let's say, weeks. I don't know how long it would be, but days to weeks, to be able to take a call, be the first one to say, 911, what's your emergency? And then immediately triage it to whomever is required to respond. I think the 18 months is a long time, and they do. I think they do some on-the-job training during that 18 months, so that after that period they're able to independently take a call. But I think a basic 911 triage officer would be a good person to insert into the system right now, because it really is a crisis.
Absolutely. And even if, the response of the members of council who were present was that they're aware of the problem. They've been working on it, sending more funding, but they've been working on it for a couple of years. This is not a problem that just emerged now. Maybe it will take a while longer to have the ideal system, but I think it's a terrible mistake to wait for the perfect and not, in the immediate, have the good. That's a classic problem. And as you say, I think, even if not every call is answered perfectly, the downside of having important calls not get responded to at all is just unacceptable. We're better off. Every system has some faults, some mistakes, but we're going to have a lot fewer critical mistakes if we get those calls answered by people who then have a network of more experienced people to take over when the call needs a lot of attention. But a lot of the calls can be moved off that emergency grid right away, saving the resources of the folks that are answering. I'm sure they're trying to do triage, but you can't do triage if you don't have that immediate response. One other thing that was troubling to me, and I'll be interested in here, again, I'm not an expert on the system, but I understand that their metrics exclude, when they're thinking about how long are people waiting it on average in the 95% of cases before they get some human being that they're talking to. I believe that they exclude calls where there is a hangup. Well, I'm sure there are some crank calls where somebody or mistaken calls where somebody dials and immediately hangs up. That would actually help their numbers. But a lot of the hangups, I would assume, in my case and the other woman, we hung up once there were resources there, 10, 15 minutes later, something like that, because it was no longer relevant. Once the first responders got there for other reasons, not through 911. So I suspect that a lot of the longest hold times are not even counted in that database. And that raises further problems. But in any event, it just seems to me the bottom line is pretty simple, which is that we ought to have a very clear, very short metric. I would say 3 rings, somebody might debate that, but something like that, or some number of seconds, where in almost every case, there is a human being who has answered that phone. I know they're talking about trying to add AI and artificial intelligence and things like that. Maybe down the road, although frankly, for those of us that have been through phone trees, I'd be a little skeptical of that as a perfect solution right now. But there may be areas where technology can help. We should work toward that. But in the meantime, you have to have a human solution, and it should be an absolute top priority.
Yeah. Well, right now, a good proportion of the waiting time is a recorded message in English and then in Spanish, and I think that's inserted in there because they know that there's going to be a wait time. Obviously, we want to know, up front what the emergency is, but I think there's no substitute for a human contact. My other concern is a lack of surge capacity. We have poor performance on a routine basis, and I think one thing they probably look at is peak hours versus off hours. But even with routine response times, we're not meeting standard. What about if we had a weather event like they had back on the East Coast, or a mass casualty incident, or an earthquake, or an active shooter, where there's going to be potentially dozens of people injured, and certainly maybe hundreds of calls coming in. So planning for that surge in usage is also part of the discussion.
I would agree completely. I think number one, even absent a catastrophic major event, we ought to be staffed for sort of peak load rather than average load, and then have things for people to do when they're not getting overwhelmed with calls. But you can find other things for people to do, and then, as you say, have a backup, have a second group ready to surge when you have a really once in quite a while event.
Yeah.
But and I'm sure they probably feel like it's a bit of a moving target, because Portland has a number of problems that have been increasing the demand for services.
Sure.
Or should be. Some people are giving up. That's another real problem. I think, I've heard episodically from people who say, oh, I don't call 911 anymore. Shopkeepers and folks, or they speculate, if I had a family member who had a health emergency, I might try 911, but I'd also try and get them to a medical facility right away on my own, even if that's not the most effective, safe way to do it, if we could get services. So I think there are a lot of problems, but again, this, it seems to me, is a problem that is fixable. I never minimize the difficulty of fixing any problem, but this one seems pretty straightforward. It does take some resources. It does take some flexibility, some thinking outside of the normal method, some ability to say, okay, we're not going to be able to train everybody for 18 months. I frankly, I'm skeptical that 18 months is really necessary for this task, but I don't know that. But, we train people for lots of things in much shorter time than that. But leaving aside, even if the most, sophisticated level person in this operation, I'm sure it's a tough job, does need 18 months, including practical on-scene work and training. Surely for the triage folks, there's got to be an emergency shorter path so we can get it staffed up and functioning while we're waiting for whatever the long-term solution. If there is a longer-term solution they've got in mind, fine. If they've got a better solution, do it. But we have to have something in the interim. We can't wait 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, or it could be longer than that. We're only talking about one cohort and then another cohort, and and people will be leaving. I mean, we're not talking about really solving this problem yet.
Yeah. Well, I think you described the system as kind of a crazy quilt system where it's not really clear who's actually in charge. It'd be interesting to see what you learn when you visit with the head of the Board of Bureau of Emergency Communications. But the county's involved, the city's involved, the police and fire are, I don't know what their involvement is. Some systems around the country, they manage their own 911 system. So they are actually out of the loop in terms of direct management. So, when you got that many cooks, it's hard to, for any one group to take control and command of decision making.
Well, not to step outside of our topic, but I hope I'm wrong. But frankly, I've been worried about our structure for a long time, and I'm not that there's some good things about the new format of government in Portland, but I'm not terribly optimistic that it's going to make it easier to solve our problems because, as you say, we have some responsibilities with city, we have some responsibilities with county, we have some responsibilities with metro, and we have a school district, a transit authority. I'm not saying you can put everything together, but rather than, adding more layers, I think some form of consolidation or at least clarification of what responsibility does each have, and maybe some swapping of things so that there's a more logical organization, so that one entity has the final responsibility and the authority to tackle a problem from beginning to end. Because if you don't have that, especially when things are difficult and going badly, it's very easy to say, well, we don't really have the final authority over every aspect of this, and so it's not really fully our responsibility. It's too easy in human nature to do that. I'm not picking on anybody individually, but I do think the structure is not terribly conducive to efficient solving of problems.
Yeah, we'll see. It'll be a very interesting time living in Portland over the next three or 4 years to see how that all plays out. I completely agree with you. I'm not to get too off topic, but I'm reminded of the film Living, which was a remake of a Japanese film about a bureaucracy where every office in the bureaucracy none of them took responsibility for a project. It was always somebody else's responsibility, and then things basically got put in the perpetual inbox and were never dealt with. Not to say that we're going to be like that, but I can see there's potential for that.
It's always a risk, and I think it's important for everybody to try and find ways to clarify lines of responsibility and to start taking on problems and saying them to the solution, not just saying, well, we're looking at it or we're studying it. I mean, you do have to think about things. I'm not recommending, with some of our bigger problems, they do require fairly sophisticated responses. I mean, dealing with the unhoused, with homeless, that's a very complex problem, obviously. But again, we have to be making more progress more rapidly there as well. I'm not saying that. That's not, I think one of the reasons for solving 911 quickly is it seems to me it is a relatively easily solvable problem, at least for an interim solution.
Mhm.
And if we do that, it begins to build confidence that the
Yes,
city can solve problems again, and
right.
citizens will start getting involved. This is still a wonderful place. There are many good people of goodwill,
Absolutely.
lots of intelligence, lots of innovation, but a lot of people, sadly, are sort of giving up or thinking we can't really make a difference, and so we're not gonna spend our time on it. And I think it's
Yeah.
important for all the government entities and for all of us privately to keep pushing to get some of these problems solved so that people can see that there's some progress. We're not gonna solve all the complex problems in the next 3 weeks or 3 months or probably even 3 years, but we certainly can make an important amount of progress on all of them and solve some of them. We should start picking off the ones that need to be solved right away and get them solved.
Yeah. Yeah, I completely agree, Steve. And, it strikes me that we use the term emergency or crisis pretty liberally. We've had a housing crisis or a housing emergency for going on 7 or 8 years now. And to me, a crisis requires not continuing with business as usual, but being very creative, trying new things, maybe pilot projects, maybe opening the conversation to innovators and really trying solutions. And some things will work and some things won't, but at least continuing to do the same thing over and over again and doing more of it will not get us out of a situation that requires very creative thinking.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. But let's end on this, that Portland's a great place to live. It's worth saving. And I think the people of Portland deserve the best services and the best government they can get. And I think this part of this conversation is in support of that. So I appreciate your words and your
Well,
wisdom.
thanks for your involvement. Pleasure to be with you, Patrick.
Same here. Thank you, Steve.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.